It was a really hard week of the wedding, and she was upset about something, but she owned it and she apologized and she brought me flowers and a note apologizing. What was hard to
Things aren't looking good for Meghan Markle. But let me ask you something right now. What happens when a story that was supposed to showcase a woman's pain, a woman's truth, begins to unravel so spectacularly that it threatens her very freedom? This isn't just about family drama. This isn't just about palace whispers. This is about a claim Meghan Markle herself chose to spotlight on one of the biggest television platforms in the world, Oprah Winfrey's primetime interview, and how that single story, about a bridesmaid's dress, has spiraled into something darker, heavier, and far more dangerous than she could have imagined. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. You remember the claim, don't you? Meghan looked Oprah dead in the eye and told the world that Kate Middleton, the future queen, made her cry in the days before her wedding. It was meant to flip the narrative. It was meant to draw sympathy. But leaked palace emails, staff testimony, and hidden memos now reveal it was Meghan who left Kate Middleton in tears. Yes, the truth was the exact opposite of what she told millions of viewers. And if this were only a matter of gossip, perhaps it would have blown over. But it didn't. Because Meghan, emboldened, repeated those same claims in legal filings, attaching questionable documents in an attempt to back herself up. And that's when the line was crossed, from gossip to crime, from accusation to perjury. But let's rewind for a moment. Can you imagine the stakes on that day, the royal wedding? It wasn't just any wedding. It was a global event, with billions of eyes glued to the screen. Every detail mattered. The flowers, the carriage, the ceremony, the music, and yes, even the bridesmaid dresses. And at the heart of it all were two women. Meghan Markle, stepping into her role as Duchess of Sussex, and Kate Middleton, the poised but heavily burdened Duchess of Cambridge, balancing royal duty with motherhood. The dress fitting was supposed to be a small footnote in history. Instead,
it's really important for people to understand the truth. I would hope that she would have wanted that corrected, and maybe in the same way that the palace wouldn't let anybody else negate it, they wouldn't let her, because
has become the spark that ignited a scandal big enough to send shockwaves through courts, headlines, and households alike. Here's where things start to unravel. Meghan told the world she was the one who suffered. That Kate had been the aggressor. That Kate had been cold, unkind, dismissive. It fit perfectly into the narrative Meghan wanted to paint. A woman trapped by an icy monarchy, a victim of its rigid traditions, and the family who wouldn't welcome her. The world gasped, and many believed her. But behind palace walls, staff were biting their tongues, because they had seen something very different. And their emails proved it. Think about that for a moment. Emails. Cold, factual, time-stamped evidence. They don't lie. They don't bend to emotion. They don't favor anyone. And those emails told a very different story. They told the story of Kate Middleton, heavily pregnant, under immense stress, trying to navigate a wedding circus while also dealing with her own young children. They told the story of Kate being reduced to tears, not Meghan. And yet, in front of Oprah, Meghan flipped the narrative entirely. Now, why does this matter? Because when you put something in a TV interview, it's gossip. It's dramatic, yes, but it doesn't carry the same weight. When you put that same story in a legal filing.
What was hard to get over was being blamed for something that not only I didn't do, but that happened to me.
When you attach documents to prove it, when you submit it as fact to a court, that's not gossip anymore. That's perjury if it's false. That's obstruction if you mislead. That's falsification if the documents don't hold up. Suddenly, this isn't about who cried over a dress. This is about who lied on.
Made me cry, and it really hurt my feelings. And I thought, in the context of everything else that was going on in those days leading to the wedding, that
under oath. And here's where the story takes a sharp, shocking turn. Investigators didn't just brush past Meghan's filings. They dissected them. They questioned the documents. They pulled metadata. They lined up testimony. And the cracks began to show. What Meghan thought would bolster her case only tore it apart. The contradictions stacked up higher and higher until they could no longer be ignored. The narrative collapsed. Can you see the irony here? The very thing Meghan weaponized to gain sympathy became the weapon used against her. The Oprah interview was supposed to be her defining moment, her Diana-style confessional, her vindication. Instead, it has become Exhibit A in a case that could redefine her legacy forever. What was once a heartstring-tugging soundbite has mutated into a potential felony charge. The world has seen public figures fall before, but rarely has the fall been this sudden, this dramatic, and this rooted in their own words. Now, here's the question for you. Did Meghan ever think this through? Did she believe the public would rally so hard behind her that the facts wouldn't matter? Or did she think no one would dare challenge her narrative, not after the sympathy wave crashed so strongly in her favor? Because if that was her calculation, she miscalculated badly. Because the palace, quiet though it was, had receipts. Staffers who had stayed silent out of loyalty and fear eventually came forward. Emails were uncovered. Hidden memos surfaced. And when those puzzle pieces were put together, the picture was crystal clear and devastating for Meghan. But let's not gloss over the emotional weight of this moment. Picture Kate Middleton, days before her brother-in-law's wedding, heavily pregnant, exhausted, her own children restless, trying to maintain composure under relentless scrutiny. And then picture Meghan, still new to the royal machine, frustrated, fiery, clashing over the details of a dress. Words exchanged, tears shed, a fissure created that would widen into a chasm. It wasn't the monarchy that broke Kate in that moment. It wasn't the press. It wasn't the relentless pressure of duty. It was Meghan. And that truth, buried for years, is now out in the open. And here's where it gets darker. Because once investigators saw the inconsistencies in Meghan's filings, they didn't stop there. They dug deeper. They started pulling apart not just the bridesmaid story, but other claims too. What else might have been embellished? What else might have been falsified? The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became for Meghan. Suddenly, this wasn't just about a dress anymore. It was about credibility. It was about trust. It was about the very foundation of her public persona. So let me ask you this. What happens to a person's brand when the foundation of their story crumbles? Meghan wasn't just selling her side of the royal feud. She was selling authenticity. She was selling truth. She was selling the image of a woman who had been wronged, silenced, and forced to break free. That was the core of her brand. But if the truth is revealed to be a lie, what remains? If the victim becomes the perpetrator, how do you rebuild? How do you defend yourself when the evidence, the testimony, the very documents you submitted point directly at you? This is where Meghan's story veers into the truly catastrophic. Because it didn't just stop at embarrassment. It didn't just stop at a damaged reputation. The accusations against her escalated to perjury and obstruction of justice. And those aren't PR problems. Those are crimes. Serious ones. The kind that can put someone behind bars. The introduction of this story sets the stage for one of the most dramatic falls from grace in modern royal history. Meghan thought she was telling her truth. Instead, investigators say she was telling a lie. And that lie has been exposed in the most brutal way possible. The world is now watching as Meghan Markle, once celebrated as a royal rebel and symbol of modern change, faces the consequences of her own narrative. But here's the thing. If you thought this was just about a dress, you're mistaken. Because what investigators uncovered next would drag Meghan deeper into a hole she couldn't climb out of. The leaks, the testimony, the memos, this was only the beginning. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Let me ask you this. How much power does one interview really have? Can a single televised conversation shift the world's perception of a person, a family, even an entire institution? For Meghan Markle, the answer was yes. Or at least, that's what she thought. Because when she sat down across from Oprah Winfrey in that now iconic primetime interview, she believed she was writing her own truth into history. But what if that truth wasn't truth at all? What if it was the opening act of a disaster that would one day circle back and threaten her freedom? It all started with a setting designed for sympathy. The garden backdrop, Oprah's empathetic nods, Meghan's carefully chosen words and pauses. Every second crafted to draw you in, to make you feel. And for millions watching, it worked. Do you remember how the world responded? Headlines screamed about cruelty, coldness, racism, and a monarchy that suffocated rather than supported. Meghan positioned herself as the victim, the outsider who had dared to love a prince and been punished for it. But amid all the dramatic claims about titles, about security, about Archie's skin tone, there was one story that struck a particularly sharp nerve: the bridesmaid dress. Meghan told Oprah that the tabloids had twisted the narrative. The world believed Meghan had made Kate cry. But no, Meghan insisted it was the other way around. Kate made her cry, just days before the wedding. The detail was delivered with the kind of intimacy and quiet emphasis that sticks. Kate had hurt her, Meghan said, but then apologized with flowers and a note. In that moment, Meghan flipped the entire narrative on its head. Kate Middleton, the composed, perfect duchess adored by the public, had been cast as the villain. Meghan, the newcomer, the misunderstood duchess, had been cast as the victim. And let's be honest, it landed. The next day, every major outlet carried the story. Hashtags exploded on social media. Think pieces dissected the real Kate. Some commentators even called Kate cold and calculated. For Meghan, it must have felt like a win. A small but symbolic triumph in a war of perception. She had flipped the script. But the question is, did she think that narrative would go unchallenged forever? Now pause for a second and think about what was really happening behind the scenes. Staffers in Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace knew the truth. They had seen it. They had read the emails. They had been in the rooms where the conversations took place. They knew Kate was the one reduced to tears, not Meghan. And yet, they watched silently as Meghan's words spread across the globe. Why? Because at that time, silence was survival. The palace had a mantra: never complain, never explain. But silence doesn't mean absence of truth. It just means truth is waiting. And here's the contradiction that stuns me every time I think about it. Meghan knew those staffers existed. She knew there were witnesses. She knew there were digital trails, emails, messages, notes. But she still looked Oprah in the eye and told a story that flipped the truth upside down. Why? Was it arrogance? Was it desperation? Or did she believe that her public sympathy wave would be so powerful that facts would never catch up? Let's break down the psychology of that moment. Meghan was no stranger to storytelling. As an actress, she understood delivery. As a celebrity, she understood PR. She knew how to phrase a narrative so it would live in headlines long after the cameras stopped rolling. And she did it masterfully. Her pauses, her subtle expressions, her tone shifting from wounded to dignified. It was performance wrapped in vulnerability. And it worked, at least at first. But here's where things started to twist. Because if Meghan had left that bridesmaid dress story in the Oprah interview, maybe, just maybe, it would have stayed gossip. A contested memory. A he said, she said between duchesses. But she didn't leave it there. She doubled down. She repeated it in legal filings. She let it bleed into formal documents. And once it entered the realm of sworn statements, investigators had no choice but to ask which version was true. And that's the bombshell hidden
What was
inside
hard
the
to
Oprah
get
bombshell.
over
What Meghan
was
thought was
being
just
blamed
another
for something
dramatic
that not
detail
only
to
I didn't
strengthen
do,
her victim
but that
narrative
happened to
became
me.
the anchor that dragged her down. Because investigators didn't just take her word for it. They pulled the receipts, the palace emails, the hidden memos, the staff testimonies. And those receipts pointed to one shocking conclusion. Meghan had lied. Not just in the court of public opinion, but potentially in a court of law. Think about the irony for a second. That interview was meant to humanize her, to show her suffering, to frame her as the underdog fighting against a cold, unfeeling institution. And yet, it has become the most incriminating piece of evidence against her. The very thing she thought would set her free is what may have shackled her. Let's not forget the global reaction at the time. The Oprah interview wasn't just a TV event, it was a cultural earthquake. People compared it to Princess Diana's infamous Panorama interview. They called it groundbreaking, revolutionary, a reckoning for the monarchy. The world split into camps. Team Meghan, Team Kate, Team Monarchy, Team Rebels. And through it all, Meghan basked in the attention, certain that her words had cemented her place in history. But history, as it turns out, doesn't bend to performance. It bends to truth. And here's the chilling part. When investigators began lining up Meghan's words against the evidence, they noticed something else: patterns. This wasn't just one inconsistency. There were multiple claims that seemed to crumble under scrutiny. The bridesmaid dress story was the first domino. And once it fell, the rest began to topple. That's why this chapter matters so much. Because it wasn't just an interview moment. It was the start of a chain reaction Meghan could never stop once it began. Let me ask you again. Can you imagine sitting across from Oprah, telling a story you know others can disprove? Can you imagine taking that gamble with the whole world watching? Was Meghan convinced no one would dare speak against her? Did she think palace staff would remain silent forever? Or did she believe public sympathy would override the truth? Whatever her reasoning, it backfired spectacularly. And here's where the cliffhanger begins to take shape. Because after the Oprah interview aired, whispers began. Tiny leaks, anonymous briefings, insiders hinting that Meghan's story wasn't quite accurate. At first, they were drowned out by the tidal wave of sympathy. But as time went on, as more pieces surfaced, the cracks widened. And those cracks would eventually split open in the form of leaked palace emails, staff testimony, and hidden memos. The Oprah interview bombshell was not the end of Meghan's story. It was the beginning of her undoing. And what investigators discovered when they peeled back the layers would shake the foundations of everything she had built. Because if one televised claim could change public opinion, what could one leaked email do? What could one sworn testimony do? What could one hidden memo reveal? That's where we're headed. And it's darker than anything Meghan anticipated. Because next, the email spoke. And they didn't just speak. They screamed. Have you ever noticed how the smallest details often cause the biggest explosions? A dress. Not a crown. Not a title. Not even a throne. A dress. That's what this all boiled down to. But not just any dress. The bridesmaid dresses for one of the most watched weddings in modern history. Let me ask you, what happens when two duchesses clash over lace, fabric, and fit, days before billions are about to watch them walk side by side? You'd think this was trivial, something you brush aside. But in reality, this tiny seam in the fabric of the royal family tore wide open, spilling chaos, bitterness, and ultimately, scandal that no one could sew back together. So let's set the scene. May 2018, Windsor Castle. The countdown to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's wedding. The world was on fire with excitement. The media was calling it the wedding of the century. Meghan was about to marry into royalty, bringing glamour, Hollywood sparkle, and a modern twist to an ancient institution. But behind those polished palace doors, things weren't so glossy. Because while florists arranged blooms and chefs prepared feasts, there was a storm brewing in a private fitting room. The bridesmaid dresses for the young attendants, including Princess Charlotte, were being finalized. Sounds simple, right? But here's the truth. Weddings magnify emotions. Stress is already sky high. Add a royal stage, a global audience, and two strong-willed women, and sparks were bound to fly. According to palace staff who later testified, the tension began over fabric choices and fit. Meghan, a bride wanting perfection, pushed for changes. Kate, balancing royal duty and the needs of her then 4-year-old daughter Charlotte, grew frustrated. The fittings dragged. Tears welled. Voices rose. And here's where the contradiction with Meghan's Oprah claim comes into play. Because multiple witnesses say it wasn't Meghan crying that day. It was Kate. Imagine it. Kate, heavily pregnant with Prince Louis, hormones surging, juggling endless public duties, standing in that fitting room as her daughter struggled in a scratchy, uncomfortable dress. Meghan, insistent, sharp, demanding revisions. Staffers later admitted Kate walked out visibly shaken, close to tears. Some said she did cry. Others said she held it together until she got home. But either way, the emotional toll was undeniable. Now here's the kicker. Emails from staff at the time confirmed Kate's distress. Messages that said, the Duchess was upset, she was very emotional after the fitting, and she left shaken. Cold, factual lines that paint a picture Meghan tried to erase years later with her Oprah retelling. So let's pause here. Why would Meghan flip that story? Why would she take a private clash and turn it into a public narrative where she was the victim? Think about it. Sympathy. Positioning. Power. By painting Kate as the aggressor, Meghan tilted the scales. She wasn't just telling a story about a dress. She was shaping the perception of who she was in that palace. The wronged woman. The one mistreated. The one forced to endure cruelty in silence. But let's not forget the human side of this. Kate wasn't just a duchess in that moment. She was a mother. A heavily pregnant mother trying to protect her little girl from discomfort and embarrassment on the biggest stage imaginable. Can you picture it? The weight of knowing your daughter will walk down the aisle in front of cameras from every continent. Millions of people judging her every step. And you're powerless to ease her pain because the bride insists otherwise. That wasn't just stressful. That was devastating. And the irony is almost cruel. Because Meghan later told Oprah that Kate had made her cry, then apologized with flowers. But palace aides insist the opposite is true. That it was Meghan who later tried to patch things up with flowers, realizing perhaps too late how deeply Kate had been hurt. The narrative was reversed. The villain painted as the victim, and the victim erased as collateral damage. But here's where the dress story moves from private pain to public scandal. When the Oprah interview aired, and Meghan flipped the truth, palace staff were furious. They had the emails. They had the memos. They had lived through it. Yet they couldn't speak, at least not right away. Because breaking palace silence was like breaking sacred law. Behind closed doors, whispers spread. Staff confided in one another, frustrated at the blatant rewriting of history. Some even began documenting their memories more formally, in case they were ever called upon. And those documents, combined with the leaked emails, became the seeds of Meghan's unraveling years later. Now, ask yourself this. If Meghan knew these receipts existed, why risk telling the story differently? Did she think Oprah's interview would be so untouchable that no one would dare challenge it? Or did she underestimate the palace's quiet but precise ability to preserve the truth in black and white emails? Let's talk about those emails for a moment. They weren't dramatic. They weren't emotional. They were clinical, matter-of-fact, time-stamped records of what happened. And that's what makes them so damning. Because while Meghan told Oprah about her tears, the emails documented Kate's. Cold proof standing against warm storytelling. And this is where the emotional beats hit hardest. Because at the heart of this was not two duchesses fighting over tulle and seams. It was a clash of humanity and image. Kate, raw, vulnerable, and human in her distress. Meghan, image-conscious, determined, unwilling to yield even in a moment where grace might have healed everything. That choice, the refusal to bend, echoed louder than the dresses themselves. And when Meghan later told the story on Oprah, she stripped Kate of that humanity. She turned a woman's tears into her own badge of suffering. Think about how devastating that must have felt for Kate, already painted as cold and perfect, unable to show cracks. Only for the one time she did break privately to be weaponized against her publicly. That's not just unfair. That's cruel. But here's where the story escalates. Because once investigators unearthed these emails, the bridesmaid dress story was no longer gossip. It was evidence. A contradiction so glaring it begged to be dissected. And dissected it was. Every line, every timestamp, every phrase cross-checked against Meghan's interview claims, and, more importantly, her legal filings where she doubled down. And the fallout was explosive. What Meghan thought was just a small, emotional anecdote turned out to be the crack in her entire defense. Because if she could lie about this, so easily, so confidently, so publicly, what else could she have lied about? And that's the haunting question investigators carried with them as they dug deeper. The bridesmaid dress dispute wasn't just a spat. It was the match that lit the fire. And once lit, it couldn't be contained. Because after the emails came the testimonies. And after the testimonies came the memos. And with every new piece of evidence, Meghan's carefully crafted narrative unraveled thread by thread. So here's the cliffhanger for you. If one dress fitting could spark this level of chaos, what do you think happened when investigators opened the palace inboxes and saw what else was hiding there? Because the emails didn't just talk about dresses. They talked about much, much more. And that's where the real nightmare began. What's more dangerous than gossip whispered behind closed doors? Gossip written down, stamped with a date, preserved forever in a digital trail that can't be erased. That's the real power of emails. And when palace emails began to surface, the truth about Meghan Markle's narrative didn't just trickle out. It poured like a flood. So here's the question. What happens when carefully guarded palace secrets, long buried in inboxes, suddenly see daylight? Do they clear the air, or do they expose a storm? At first, it was subtle. A leak here, a message there. But as investigators dug deeper, what they uncovered wasn't just about a bridesmaid dress anymore. It was about the culture of silence. About staff members documenting moments they knew could one day come back to haunt them. Because let's be honest, when you're serving royalty, you know history is always watching. And history, as it turns out, was archived in Outlook folders and flagged memos. Imagine the moment investigators opened that first trove of emails. Dry subject lines, bridesmaid fitting update, meeting notes, follow-up on incident. Innocent on the surface. But inside those messages were fragments of conversations that painted an entirely different picture than the one Meghan shared on Oprah. One email from a senior aide described Kate as visibly upset after leaving the fitting. Another documented that the Duchess of Cambridge was in tears and required reassurance before attending a scheduled engagement. These weren't whispers. These were official records, time-stamped, eyewitness accounts captured in real time. And once investigators held them in their hands, Meghan's story began to crumble. But here's the twist. The emails didn't stop with Kate's tears. They hinted at something bigger, a pattern. Meghan's confrontations with staff, her sharp words, the way tension seemed to follow her into rooms. The word difficult appeared more than once. And as investigators combed through, they realized the bridesmaid dress dispute wasn't an isolated moment. It was part of a larger pattern of behavior, documented by the very people Meghan insisted were against her. Now ask yourself, why would palace staff, known for their discretion, start recording these details so meticulously? Were they simply doing their jobs, protecting the institution? Or were they quietly building a file, knowing one day those details might matter? Let's not forget, the monarchy thrives on silence. Staff are trained not to talk, not to reveal, not to gossip outside the palace walls. Yet here, inside their inboxes, they preserved everything, as if they knew. As if they sensed that one day, truth would need a paper trail. And here's the cruel irony. Meghan thought she was untouchable when she told Oprah her version. But those palace emails, cold, unemotional, stripped of performance, stood waiting, like silent witnesses ready to step forward. Picture it. Investigators printing stacks of emails, laying them out on long tables, highlighting contradictions, building a timeline. Meghan says one thing in 2021, but in 2018, staff wrote something entirely different. One narrative built on emotion, another on fact. Which one do you think carries more weight in a courtroom? But let's humanize this for a moment. Behind those emails were people, staffers who had given years, sometimes decades, of service to the crown. People who endured long hours, endless demands, and often thankless tasks. These weren't just clerks. They were guardians of memory. And when they wrote down that Kate was in tears, they weren't thinking of Oprah or Netflix or lawsuits. They were simply documenting reality. That's what makes their words so powerful now. They weren't crafted for the public. They weren't rehearsed. They were raw records of moments as they unfolded. And Meghan? She must have known those records existed. That's the most puzzling part of all. Did she think they'd stay buried forever? Did she underestimate how far investigators would go once legal filings were in play? Or did she believe that her celebrity shield, the sympathy she'd garnered, would keep those records from ever surfacing? But truth doesn't stay buried. Not forever. And when those emails leaked, first in whispers to journalists, then in formal handovers to investigators, they didn't just contradict Meghan. They exposed her. They turned her victim narrative on its head. And here's a surprising contradiction that sent shockwaves through investigators. Meghan's own legal team had submitted documents meant to support her claim. But when cross-checked against palace emails, they clashed. The timelines didn't align. The language didn't match. In some cases, details were outright reversed. Imagine the impact of that. Her own filings undermined by objective records sitting in palace archives. This is where the tension skyrockets. Because perjury isn't just about lying under oath. It's about knowingly misrepresenting facts when evidence exists to prove otherwise. And those emails? They were the evidence. Meghan's statements said one thing. The emails said another. And once that contradiction was highlighted, the legal lens shifted sharply from sympathy to suspicion. Think about the emotional fallout of this. Meghan, who once commanded the world's empathy, now cornered by the very system she tried to expose. Every email became a dagger. Every timestamp another nail in the coffin of her credibility. And yet, instead of backing down, she doubled down. She insisted her memory was right, that her truth was unshakable. But how do you fight against black and white text? Against words written in the heat of the moment, long before any scandal brewed? Now here's the most haunting part. Some of those emails weren't just about dresses and tears. They hinted at Meghan's behavior towards staff. Sharp words, cold dismissals, conflicts that left seasoned aides rattled. Words like bullying began to appear in patterns. And investigators realized the bridesmaid dress was only the beginning of a much larger story about Meghan's relationship with the people around her. So let me ask you, if one fitting could spark a tear-filled email, what about the moments no one ever spoke about publicly? What about the clashes that didn't make it to Oprah? What if the bridesmaid dress was simply the tip of an iceberg that emails began to reveal piece by piece? And here's where the emotional irony twists the knife. Meghan once said she felt silenced, but in reality, it was palace staff who were silenced. They had the truth locked in their inboxes, unseen and unheard. Until now. And when their words finally surfaced, Meghan's silent strategy collapsed. By the time investigators finished combing through those emails, the narrative wasn't just shaky. It was shattered. Meghan's carefully crafted truth didn't align with the records. And the question wasn't who made who cry anymore. It was what else has she lied about? And that's the cliffhanger that propelled this case into overdrive. Because if the emails could expose contradictions this easily, what would happen when staff themselves took the stand? When their voices, long muted, finally echoed in the open? That's where we're heading next. And trust me, it's louder, sharper, and far more devastating than anything Meghan anticipated. What happens when a story told on television, wrapped in emotion and performance, makes the dangerous leap onto official paper? When words that once floated in the air as gossip are pinned down in ink as sworn statements. That's the turning point. That's the line Meghan Markle crossed. And once she crossed it, there was no going back. On Oprah, Meghan was playing to hearts. In filings, she was playing to judges. And the rules are very different. Judges don't care about delivery. They don't care about sympathy pauses or carefully placed tears. They care about facts. Hard, provable, consistent facts. And when Meghan repeated her claims about Kate and the bridesmaid dresses in legal documents, the entire game changed. Think about this for a moment. In the world of public opinion, truth can be flexible. People remember how a story made them feel more than they remember exact details. But in the world of law, truth is rigid. It's dissected. It's time-stamped. It's compared against every shred of available evidence. And when investigators began to compare Meghan's sworn claims to palace records, the cracks that started with the Oprah interview widened into canyons. Now here's where the emotional stakes skyrocket. Because Meghan didn't just casually mention the bridesmaid dispute in legal paperwork. She leaned on it. She used it as a cornerstone of her narrative of mistreatment, of her portrayal as a victim within the royal family. It wasn't just anecdotal anymore. It was evidence, or at least, she presented it that way. But evidence has weight. And if that evidence is false, it doesn't just collapse, it crushes everything around it. So let's ask the tough question. Why would Meghan risk putting a disputed memory into a legal filing? Was it desperation? Was it arrogance? Or was it sheer miscalculation, believing the palace would never release its records to contradict her? Here's the twist. For years, Meghan had thrived in spaces where narrative was everything. Hollywood, media, public relations. In those arenas, perception shapes reality. But in a courtroom, perception means nothing without proof. And this time, proof wasn't on her side. Investigators began with the obvious. The emails, the memos, the testimonies. All of them painting Kate as the one who cried, not Meghan. But then came the deeper dive. Metadata on documents Meghan's team had submitted. Formatting inconsistencies. Timeline issues. It was like pulling at loose threads on a dress. The more they tugged, the more the fabric unraveled. And here's where the emotional irony hits hardest. Meghan once claimed the palace silenced her. But in reality, she silenced herself by locking her narrative into sworn documents. Once her words were written down, they became a trap she couldn't escape. Every contradiction became a potential charge. Every embellishment a potential lie. Now picture the investigator's mindset. They weren't watching Oprah clips anymore. They weren't scrolling headlines. They were analyzing filings line by line. Statement versus statement. Claim versus record. And the inconsistencies weren't small. They were glaring. Dates didn't align. Descriptions didn't match. Even the supposed apology flowers story flipped when compared against staff notes. Instead of Kate apologizing to Meghan, records suggested Meghan had sent flowers to Kate. The reversal wasn't just embarrassing. It was incriminating. So let me ask you, how do you think a judge reacts when a key part of your case is not only unsubstantiated, but actively disproved by independent evidence. Do they brush it aside? Or do they start asking what else you might have lied about? This is where the weight of perjury began to press down. Because perjury isn't about one false word. It's about intent. Did you knowingly provide information you knew was false? And if so, why? To gain sympathy? To sway a case? To protect an image? Whatever the reason, the law doesn't care. Falsehood under oath is falsehood, plain and simple. The filings became Meghan's undoing because they showed a pattern. She wasn't just telling her truth in casual interviews. She was cementing it in spaces where truth is non-negotiable. And that's when the charge shifted. From gossip to crime. And think of the dramatic irony here. Meghan went into that interview with Oprah hoping to reclaim her narrative. She went into filings hoping to protect her reputation. But instead, she walked straight into a trap she built herself. Her own words became weapons in the hands of investigators. Her own documents became the evidence stacked against her. This raises another question. Where was Harry in all of this? Was he aware of the risks? Did he know the filings might not hold up under scrutiny? Or was he, like the public, swept up in the narrative Meghan had spun, blind to the cracks forming beneath it? His silence during these moments is deafening. Because as Meghan submitted documents, as she repeated claims, he didn't stop her. He stood by. And that silence now looks less like loyalty and more like complicity. But here's the twist investigators didn't expect. Meghan didn't just risk her own reputation by submitting these claims. She risked implicating others. Staff names, references to specific incidents, even attempts to lean on supporting documents that didn't fully align. In other words, she pulled others into her narrative, and when the truth didn't match, it wasn't just her credibility collapsing. It was dragging others down with her. The courtroom atmosphere changed. What began as sympathy toward a duchess claiming mistreatment turned into suspicion. Lawyers sharpened their focus. Judges raised eyebrows. Words like perjury, obstruction, and falsified evidence began to circulate. The tone shifted from understanding to accusation. And here's the emotional gut punch. Meghan, who once painted herself as the silenced woman, now stood accused of weaponizing lies. Not just against Kate, not just against the monarchy, but against truth itself. The filings weren't just paperwork. They were a declaration. And that declaration, once dissected, became the cornerstone of a case that threatened everything Meghan had built. Her reputation, her freedom, her legacy. So let's end on this question. If Meghan's own filings could betray her, what would happen when the documents she presented as evidence were torn apart in open court? Because next came the real shocker. The documents themselves weren't just questionable. Some suggested something far worse. Something investigators couldn't ignore. And that's when the whispers of falsification began. What's more dangerous than a lie told on camera? A lie written down, dressed up as proof, and handed to investigators as if it were solid gold. That's where Meghan Markle stumbled into the abyss. Let me ask you this. What happens when the very documents you use to defend yourself become evidence against you? When your proof doesn't just fail, it collapses so dramatically that it suggests something darker than a mistake. That's the story of the questionable documents. At first, the filings Meghan's legal team submitted seemed straightforward. Notes, records, supporting statements meant to back up her claim that Kate had made her cry before the wedding. On the surface, they looked neat, tidy, official. But documents have a funny way of telling their own story. Paper remembers. Metadata remembers. And when investigators put those submissions under a microscope, the cracks started to glow like neon signs. One memo, supposedly drafted around the time of the bridesmaid fitting, was riddled with inconsistencies. The date didn't line up with palace schedules. The wording didn't match the style of communications from that office. Even the font and formatting looked off. It was as if someone had tried to replicate palace correspondence without fully understanding how meticulous royal documentation really is. And that's when suspicions grew. Was this a sloppy mistake? Or was it deliberate fabrication? Think about the weight of that question. Because a mistake can be forgiven, a falsification cannot. If Meghan knowingly submitted altered or manufactured documents, that isn't just bending the truth, it's obstruction of justice. It's perjury on steroids. It's crossing a line few public figures ever dare to cross. Now here's where the emotional irony cuts deep. Meghan had always positioned herself as the truth teller, the silenced duchess who found her voice. But these documents suggested something else entirely. A woman desperate to maintain her narrative, even if it meant bending reality to fit her story. Investigators pulled apart every piece. They didn't just glance, they dissected. They checked email headers. They analyzed digital timestamps. They compared the language to genuine palace memos. And the more they dug, the more alarming it became. One so-called apology note looked particularly suspicious. Supposedly written by Kate, it contained phrases she never used. Staff testified that the tone was wildly out of character. And when compared against Kate's known style, it was clear this wasn't her. Imagine the gut punch of that discovery. A note waved around as proof of Kate's guilt suddenly flipping into proof of Meghan's deception. It was like holding up a shield only to realize it's made of glass, and it shatters in your hands. But here's the part that will make you shake your head. Meghan's team tried to argue these discrepancies were minor. Formatting errors, misfiled copies, harmless mistakes. But can a judge ignore patterns of mistakes that all seem to tilt in Meghan's favor? Can you really explain away mismatched metadata as coincidence? And this is where the contradictions piled high. Witnesses swore that Kate cried. Emails showed she cried. Staff testified to her distress. And yet Meghan submitted documents that painted herself as the one wronged, with evidence that crumbled under scrutiny. It wasn't just a he said, she said anymore. It was a paper trail versus a paper trick. Now, let's step back for a moment and think about motive. Why risk it? Why would Meghan, a woman already under global scrutiny, gamble with questionable evidence? Was it desperation to win at all costs? Was it arrogance, believing no one would dare call her out? Or was it the simple miscalculation that sympathy would outweigh scrutiny? Because here's the truth. Sympathy may win you headlines, but it will never win you a courtroom. And the courtroom is where this fight had landed. Judges don't care about how you felt. They care about what you can prove. And in Meghan's case, the documents meant to prove her story only prove the opposite. Here's where the drama sharpens into a blade. Once whispers of falsification began, the language in the investigation shifted. This wasn't just about Meghan misremembering or exaggerating. This was about intent. Intent to deceive. Intent to manipulate evidence. Intent to obstruct. And that intent opened the door to criminal charges that could not be ignored. Now let's pause and picture Meghan in this moment. A woman once adored, celebrated, photographed in designer gowns, speaking to crowds about empowerment. Now sitting across from lawyers and investigators, watching them dismantle her own submissions line by line. Can you imagine the shock? The humiliation? The slow realization that the story you built is collapsing in front of you, and the wreckage is your own doing? The public didn't see these documents at first. They only saw whispers and headlines. Investigators questioned Meghan's filings. Inconsistencies emerge. But behind closed doors, the details were brutal. Digital forensics reports highlighting alterations. Staff testimonies pointing out false notes. Lawyers circling phrases in red ink, asking, who really wrote this? And that question, who wrote this, became a drumbeat. If Meghan didn't write them, who did? If her team prepared them, were they complicit? Were they misled by Meghan herself? Suddenly, the circle of suspicion widened. It wasn't just Meghan under scrutiny. It was everyone attached to her case. That's the danger of falsified documents. They don't just sink one person. They drag everyone connected into the undertow. And here's where the contradictions sting even more. Meghan had preached about authenticity, about telling her truth, about transparency. Yet here she was, accused of presenting falsehoods dressed as fact. It's the ultimate betrayal of her own brand. The very foundation she had built, truth-telling, now poisoned by allegations of fabrication. So let me ask you, what happens when your greatest weapon, your voice, your narrative, becomes the very rope that hangs you? Do you keep fighting? Do you deny harder? Or do you realize, too late, that silence might have saved you? Because Meghan didn't stay silent. She doubled down. She defended the documents. She insisted they were legitimate. But every defense only deepened the hole. And investigators? They weren't backing off. They were circling closer, emboldened by every crack they uncovered. And then came the most damning revelation yet. Hidden deep in the metadata of one document was a clue, one that pointed to recent edits made long after the incident supposedly took place. That discovery blew the case wide open. It wasn't just questionable anymore. It was undeniable. Someone had tampered with the record. That single detail shifted the entire investigation into overdrive. Because if one document was doctored, what about the others? If one note was altered, how deep did the deception go? And that's the cliffhanger we're left with now. Because what investigators uncovered in the next phase didn't just cast doubt on Meghan's filings. It suggested something much darker, that Meghan, or someone acting on her behalf, may have deliberately manipulated evidence. And that accusation would change everything. Got it. Picking up from the last cliffhanger, because what investigators uncovered in the next phase didn't just cast doubt on Meghan's filings. It suggested something much darker, that Meghan, or someone acting on her behalf, may have deliberately manipulated evidence. And that accusation would change everything. Now we move into Chapter 6. Investigators step in. What happens when whispers turn into a full-scale investigation? When the quiet doubts of insiders suddenly transform into the sharp focus of legal authorities. That's the moment Meghan Markle's world shifted from scandal to survival. Because once investigators stepped in, this wasn't about PR anymore. It wasn't about gossip. It wasn't about perception. It was about truth, evidence, and accountability. And the thing about investigators? They don't care who you are. Duchess, actress, celebrity. To them, you're just another subject under the microscope. Let me ask you, can you imagine the shock Meghan must have felt when she realized this was no longer a palace squabble, no longer a tabloid headline, but a matter of criminal law? One moment, she was defending her narrative in glossy interviews. The next, she was facing questions from professionals trained to detect lies, dissect evidence, and build cases piece by piece. At first, the investigation was discreet. Quiet interviews, subtle requests for documents, a behind-the-scenes review of Meghan's submissions. But it didn't stay quiet for long. Because the deeper investigators dug, the more troubling their findings became. And soon, what started as a review ballooned into a full inquiry into perjury, obstruction of justice, and potential evidence tampering. Think about the irony. Meghan had once complained of being silenced. But now, investigators were silencing her excuses with cold, hard facts. They started with the questionable documents. Digital forensics experts were called in. Metadata was examined line by line, and the truth began to emerge. Edits had been made, not just once, multiple times, long after the incident supposedly took place. In some cases, alterations were made only weeks before the filings were submitted. That alone was explosive. Because if you're presenting a document as evidence of what happened years ago, why does the file show it was edited recently? That discovery set off alarm bells. Investigators knew they weren't just dealing with a messy memory. They were dealing with potential falsification. And the law takes that seriously. But the investigation didn't stop there. They interviewed staff members, aides, assistants, people who had been in the room during the infamous bridesmaid dress dispute. And their testimonies were damning. One aide described Kate leaving the fitting room, visibly shaken. Another confirmed she had tears in her eyes. A third said Meghan had been sharp and uncompromising during the dispute. Each account reinforced the palace emails. Each one contradicted Meghan's Oprah narrative and her filings. So here's the question. How many witnesses does it take before a story collapses completely? 1, 2, or a chorus of voices all saying the same thing? For investigators, the answer was clear. The weight of testimony was overwhelming. And here's where the emotional beat deepens. Meghan, who once cast herself as the victim, now looked like the aggressor. Her carefully crafted image of the silenced Duchess shattered under the weight of staff who had once remained loyal. These weren't tabloids twisting her words. These were people she had worked with daily, people who had served her. And now, they were standing against her, sworn under oath. The investigators documented everything. Statements, timelines, contradictions. Each piece became a brick in the case they were building. And with every brick, Meghan's wall of defense crumbled further. But let's not overlook the psychological impact of this. Imagine Meghan in Montecito, scrolling through headlines as whispers of the investigation leaked. Imagine Harry, torn between defending his wife and confronting the possibility that she had gone too far. Imagine the tension in their home as lawyers called, as new revelations broke, as the narrative they'd built together began to collapse. Because this wasn't just about Meghan anymore. It was about both of them. Harry had stood beside her during the Oprah interview. He had supported her publicly. And now, as investigators tore apart her claims, questions began to surface. Did Harry know? Had he been misled? Or worse, had he been complicit in repeating a lie? The stakes were higher than ever. And then came the turning point. Investigators uncovered evidence that suggested Meghan's legal team might not have been fully transparent either. Some documents appeared to have been prepared under her direct instruction. Others seemed to show inconsistencies her lawyers should have flagged. Suddenly, it wasn't just Meghan on the line. It was her entire defense apparatus. And that widened the scope of the inquiry. Now think about the emotional irony. Meghan had once said the palace failed to protect her. But now, it was her legal team who couldn't protect her from herself, from her own words, from her own evidence. As the investigation intensified, the tone of coverage shifted. No longer was Meghan framed as a brave truth-teller taking on the monarchy. Headlines began to ask harder questions. Did Meghan lie? Were documents falsified? Is a duchess facing criminal charges? Public sympathy started to waver. And once public sympathy slips, it rarely returns. But the investigators weren't watching headlines. They were focused on facts. And the facts told a damning story. Meghan's claims in the Oprah interview didn't align with palace records. Her filings doubled down on those claims. And the documents she submitted to back herself up showed signs of tampering. That's a trifecta of disaster. Contradiction, perjury, obstruction. And yet Meghan didn't back down. She continued to deny wrongdoing. She insisted the evidence was legitimate. She portrayed herself as the target of a smear campaign. But denial doesn't erase digital trails. It doesn't silence sworn testimony. It doesn't erase timestamps. So let me ask you, how far can denial carry you when the facts are stacked against you? Can you bluff your way through an investigation? Or does every denial only deepen the suspicion? For Meghan, every denial seemed to backfire. Every new statement invited further scrutiny. And investigators, emboldened by each revelation, dug deeper still. And then came the blow no one saw coming. During a routine review of Meghan's filings, investigators stumbled upon a document so deeply flawed, so clearly inconsistent, that it shifted the case into a whole new gear. It wasn't just questionable. It was explosive. Because this document didn't just fail to back up Meghan's story, it actively contradicted it. And that revelation set the stage for the most devastating turn yet. What's the one word no celebrity, no politician, no royal ever wants attached to their name in a courtroom? Perjury. It's not just a mistake. It's not just a bad look. It's a crime. A crime that says, you lied under oath. You tried to deceive the court. And for Meghan Markle, that word, perjury, was about to land like a hammer. Let me ask you this. What happens when your carefully crafted truth doesn't just unravel, it becomes a felony? Because that's exactly what investigators concluded when they compared Meghan's claims, her documents, and the evidence stacked against her. At first, there were whispers, inconsistencies, contradictions, words that leave wiggle room. But once investigators locked onto the document that contradicted Meghan's filings directly, wiggle room disappeared. The contradictions weren't minor. They weren't a matter of memory lapses. They were blatant, deliberate, and damning. And that's when prosecutors began preparing the most shocking accusation yet, that Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, had committed perjury. Now pause and picture the irony. Meghan had once accused the monarchy of silencing her, of ignoring her suffering. But now it was the legal system accusing her of something much more serious, falsifying her own suffering. The silenced duchess transformed into the lying duchess in the eyes of the law. The charge of perjury is heavy. To prove it, prosecutors had to show intent. Not just that Meghan got details wrong, but that she knowingly misrepresented the truth. And here's where the emails, the testimonies, and the questionable documents became devastating. They didn't just contradict Meghan's claims. They showed a pattern, a deliberate effort to rewrite reality. Think about that. A deliberate effort. That's the line between an error and a crime. And once perjury was on the table, obstruction of justice followed. Because if you lie under oath, if you submit doctored evidence, you're not just misrepresenting. You're obstructing the process itself. You're muddying the truth. You're wasting the court's time. You're undermining the entire system. And Meghan now stood accused of doing exactly that. Now let's talk about the emotional fallout. Imagine Meghan in her Montecito home, hearing her lawyers whisper that prosecutors were considering charges. Imagine Harry pacing the floor, realizing that their entire post-royal brand, the truth tellers, the rebels against the monarchy, was now at risk of being legally exposed as liars. Imagine the silence in that house, broken only by the frantic tapping of phones, the desperate calls to advisors, the whispered questions. How bad is this? What happens if? Because let's be real, this wasn't just about Meghan's reputation anymore. It was about her freedom. Perjury can carry jail time. Obstruction of justice can carry fines, sanctions, even imprisonment. For a duchess, for a Hollywood celebrity, the image of being led into court in handcuffs isn't just humiliating, it's catastrophic. But here's the twist. Meghan didn't retreat. She didn't back down. She doubled down. She insisted the charges were politically motivated, part of a smear campaign orchestrated by the monarchy and its allies. She portrayed herself once again as the victim, claiming she was being punished for daring to speak out. And maybe, for a moment, that strategy worked in the court of public opinion. Some loyal supporters rallied. Hashtags trended. A few sympathetic headlines appeared. But in the courtroom, sympathy doesn't erase contradictions. Hashtags don't silence testimony. Public opinion doesn't override evidence. The prosecutors laid it out bluntly. Meghan said in her filings that Kate had made her cry. Emails said the opposite. Meghan submitted documents that supposedly proved her story. Metadata showed they'd been edited years later. Witnesses testified that Kate was the one reduced to tears. Meghan claimed otherwise. The case, they argued, was simple. She lied. She obstructed. She tried to deceive. And here's where the human contradiction stings. Meghan had always framed herself as authentic, as someone who valued truth above all, as a woman fighting lies told about her. Yet now, the system was accusing her of embodying the very thing she said she despised, dishonesty. So let me ask you, how do you come back from that? How do you rebuild a reputation when perjury is stamped on your record? Do you fight harder, hoping to spin the narrative again? Or do you watch, powerless, as the empire you built on words collapses under the weight of those same words? Because this is the trap Meghan had walked into. Her voice, her narrative, her truth had once been her greatest weapon. But in the cold light of the courtroom, those same tools became shackles. Her every statement was dissected, her every claim cross-examined, her every document scrutinized, and each one betrayed her. Now think about the irony for Harry, the man who left the monarchy to protect his wife, now watching as the legal system accused her of destroying herself with her own lies. How must he have felt, seeing the woman he defended reduced from duchess to defendant? Did he question her? Did he still believe her? Or did he, like the rest of the world, begin to wonder what was true and what was performance? The courtroom became the stage Meghan never wanted. Cameras outside, sketch artists inside, headlines screaming. But this wasn't Hollywood. This wasn't a Netflix documentary. This was real. This was her life. And the ending wasn't in her control. By the time prosecutors finished laying out their case, Meghan's options were narrowing. Plead guilty and risk prison. Fight the charges and risk worse. Either way, the stain of perjury and obstruction would follow her forever. And here's where the cliffhanger tightens its grip. Because just when it seemed things couldn't get any worse, prosecutors hinted at something even darker. Something buried in those documents that went beyond perjury. Something that suggested Meghan hadn't just lied. What's stronger than documents? Stronger than leaked emails? Stronger than metadata pulled from suspicious files? Voices. Real voices. People who lived through the chaos, who saw with their own eyes, who felt the tension firsthand. And when those voices finally broke their silence, Meghan Markle's defense didn't just crack, it collapsed. Let me ask you, how powerful is it when the very people once sworn to protect royal secrets step into the spotlight and say, this is what really happened? Because that's what happened when palace staff, those who had quietly served behind the scenes, were called to testify. At first, their appearance was doubted. Would they speak? Would they risk it? After all, palace aides are trained for silence. Their entire world is built on discretion. But the stakes had changed. With perjury and obstruction charges looming, investigators needed more than documents. They needed people. And slowly, reluctantly, one by one, the staff began to talk. And when they did, their words hit harder than any headline. The first testimony came from a senior aide who had overseen preparations for the wedding. Calm, professional, no tabloid flair, just facts. He recounted the bridesmaid dress fittings, Kate's visible distress, and the aftermath. His words painted a picture that matched perfectly with the leaked emails. Kate had been reduced to tears, not Meghan. Then came another, a younger staffer, clearly nervous, voice shaking at first. She described how Meghan had spoken sharply to Kate, insisting on changes, dismissing concerns about Princess Charlotte's comfort. The staffer said Kate left the room pale and shaken, trying to maintain composure. And then, in a detail that froze the courtroom, she said, "I saw her eyes. They were red. She had been crying." That moment hung in the air. Silence. The weight of truth finally spoken. But it didn't stop there. More testimonies followed. A seamstress who worked on the dresses described the atmosphere as tense and unbearable. A private secretary testified that Kate had confided in her later that day, admitting she felt humiliated and deeply upset. Each new voice added another layer, another nail in the coffin of Meghan's story. Now pause for a second. These weren't enemies of Meghan. These weren't tabloids. These were her own staff. People who had once worked tirelessly to serve her, to protect her image, to keep the machine running smoothly. And now, under oath, they were telling the truth. Can you imagine the emotional impact of that? Sitting there, hearing people you once commanded. People who addressed you as Your Royal Highness, now dismantling your narrative piece by piece. Meghan had built her story on sympathy. But staff testimonies revealed something else. A pattern of sharpness, of conflict, of disregard for others' emotions. One aide even used the word bullying. He described moments where Meghan belittled staff, dismissed their efforts, and created an atmosphere of fear. His voice was steady, unemotional, and yet his words carried the weight of lived experience. And here's where the contradictions twisted into irony. Meghan had claimed the palace silenced her. But in reality, she had silenced them through fear, through status, through power. Now, with investigators' protection, they were free to speak. And once they started, there was no stopping them. The testimonies didn't just confirm Kate's tears. They exposed a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond a dress fitting. Staff described explosive reactions over minor issues, unreasonable demands at late hours, emotional outbursts that left seasoned aides rattled. It painted a portrait of Meghan not as the victim, but as the aggressor. Now ask yourself, what's more believable in the eyes of a jury? A duchess spinning an emotional tale years after the fact, or multiple staffers, independent of one another, all telling the same story, their accounts supported by emails, memos, and contemporaneous notes? The answer was obvious. The staff testimonies didn't just tip the scales. They smashed them. And here's the emotional punch. Kate herself never testified. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than words. Her dignity remained intact, while staff carried the burden of truth on her behalf. That silence became another contrast. Meghan spoke endlessly. Kate said nothing. And in that silence, the testimonies echoed louder. By the time the last aide spoke, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted completely. Meghan's defense team looked rattled. Reporters scribbled furiously. And the public, following every word, began to see the story differently. But Meghan didn't crumble. Not yet. She stared ahead, stone-faced, refusing to acknowledge the avalanche of words burying her narrative. Was it denial? Defiance? Or was it the realization that she was losing control, one testimony at a time? And here's where the cliffhanger forms. Because as devastating as the staff testimonies were, they weren't the end. They were the setup. Because after the staff came forward, investigators revealed something even more shocking. Something hidden in the files that no one expected. Something that didn't just confirm the staff's words. It proved that Meghan had gone further than anyone thought possible. And that revelation was about to ignite the biggest explosion yet.